All right, today we're going to talk about the British Enfield cartridge, the early style. This is going to be based on the 1855 instructions from a treatise called The Instruction of Musketry, and it covers an early style of the British Enfield cartridge, one that might have been used during the Crimean War. The early style of Enfield bullets used, or Enfield cartridges rather, used a Pritchett bullet. It was a smooth-sided bullet, and originally they were about 0.568 inches in diameter. This particular one is made from a mold produced by Noe Bullet Company, that's N-O-E, and it's 5.66 inches in diameter. Also, the British Enfield cartridges were designed to have originally they had a little iron cup that was placed in this hollow cavity, and the idea was that the charge explosion would go off and drive that cup into the base and force the base to expand and take up the rifling. And they found out that that iron cup would actually get blown through the face of the bullet and leave the skirt behind and cause problems in loading. So they discarded the iron cup in favor of a boxwood plug, and later that was a clay-fired plug. So Noe Bullet Moulds also produces a plug plate that you can fill with milliput and bake them, or you can use Bondo and let it set up, and you can produce plugs for those bullets as well. Apparently the plug was found to provide superior accuracy at long ranges, like hundreds of yards. But the Confederacy, when they started making these bullets during the American Civil War, they did not use the plugs. They had discovered that the force of the charge itself was sufficient to expand the bullet. So I'm going to try to get away without using the plugs, even though this is a 1855 style of cartridge. So anyway, to get started with, the instructions to make these cartridges, like I said, are based out of a book called The Instruction of Musketry. You can find it for free from Google Books. It'll have all of the dimensions that you need and the instructions on how they were intended to be produced. So like I said, you can find that online through Google Books for free. And so I used those patterns to create a set of templates for constructing my own paper cartridge pieces. These are just made out of sheet metal, 18 gauge. You could use tin, like the manual suggests that the soldiers would have a set made out of tin or brass, or probably even use plastic. But anyway, it's just something to help you cut these out. So the other thing you're going to need is the paper. And with this particular style of cartridge, you're going to need some pretty thin paper with the large size bullet, because with the large size bullet, it doesn't take much paper to get you up to the correct diameter for the bullet. So this is called onion paper. It's 9-pound onion paper, and I found it on Amazon somewhere. So that's an important part of the cartridge. And then you're going to need a mandrel, a couple mandrels. You'll need one mandrel that you actually do the forming of the bullet on, and it needs to be about 0.53 inches in diameter. So you can use a 1/2-inch dowel and just wrap some masking tape around it, and then you're going to have to carve a bullet-shaped cavity, or a bullet nose-shaped cavity in the end of that mandrel to accept the end of the bullet in your powder chamber, which we'll get to in a minute. And then you're going to need a former, and that's just a dowel that's been formed to look like the nose of a bullet that you can use for help forming that cartridge. So the British Enfield cartridge is a little bit different from the U.S. expanding ball cartridges. This is a copy of the 1855 U.S. expanding ball cartridge. And the U.S. expanding ball cartridge was basically designed to be used in that the cartridge was really just a vehicle to carry the powder and the bullet. It wasn't an integral part of the ammunition like it is with the British Enfield. So with the U.S. Style cartridge, you would tear the tail off, dump the powder down the barrel, and then you had to break the cartridge open to extract the bullet, which is a grooved bullet that is lubricated on the bullet itself. And that bullet gets put down the barrel, and the rest of the cartridge is just thrown on the ground and discarded. But with the British Enfield style of cartridge, it was a little bit more elegant of a design in that the bullet and the outer wrapper are united together to make a paper patched bullet. So that's why these Pritchett bullets are smooth-sided and they don't carry any lube on their own. The paper does that. So the cartridge not only carried the powder that you needed to fire the weapon, but it also integrally contained the bullet as part of the cartridge, and they went ahead and made that, you know, the paper patched portion of the bullet. So to use the cartridge, you tear off the end here, put the powder down the barrel, simply invert the cartridge, stick the bullet portion into the muzzle, and then snap off the powder chamber end of the cartridge, leaving a paper patched bullet in the muzzle. And then you would drive that home just like you do for any muzzle loader. So a little bit faster to use. Now, the Enfield cartridge is a little bit more quality control error prone, I guess you could say, as opposed to the US style of cartridge. With the US style cartridge, the only thing that really matters in getting the thing to work is the diameter of the bullet. Okay, so that's the only thing that they really had to QC is to make sure that the bullet itself was the correct diameter so that it could be easily loaded when it was taken out of the cartridge. But with the Enfield cartridge, you had to be on top of three different things. First of all, you got to make sure that your bullets are the right size to start with. So those would have to be sized and gauged. Then you had to make sure that you're using good quality paper to make these things, because if you didn't have consistent quality paper or the paper was too thick, then you'd end up with a bullet that was the wrong size. And then finally, the cartridge itself has to be put together in a very particular manner and very careful manner so that the resultant product is a usable cartridge. So a little bit more finicky perhaps to make these cartridges than the US style. Another perhaps benefit of the US style over the British Enfield style is the most fragile part of the bullet and the part that's most detrimental to accuracy if you damage it is the base of the bullet. And these were designed to be deformed. So, you know, when that charge went off, it expands the tail of this bullet to make it take up the rifling and twist as it goes down the barrel. Well, if you drop one of these and it doesn't take much of a drop at all, you will dent the skirt. And either it won't load properly or it's not going to fly very well that way. So with the US style of cartridge, the tail of the bullet is kind of protected. It's in the junction up here underneath the powder cylinder. So if you drop it or it gets bounced around during shipping and handling, you know, a crate of them gets dumped, you know, roughly on the ground, they're not going to damage each other as easily perhaps as the Enfield cartridge where the tail of the bullet is exposed. So that's just another thing that might be in favor of the US style cartridge. But it's undeniable that the Enfield style of cartridge is much easier to use. You just tear the tail, dump it, invert it, tear it off, and you've got a nice paper patch bullet. Of course, also non-grooved bullets were produced primarily by pressure. They were swaged bullets. And it's far easier to produce a swaged, smooth-sided bullet than it is to swage bullets with the grease grooves. You have to have a compound mold to do that. So that's another thing going for this style of cartridge, I suppose. So when we have our templates and we have our paper, you can cut out a bunch of the three components that you need, the outer wrapper, the inner wrapper, and the stiffener, and then you're ready to go. So the first part that you construct is the powder chamber. And so you take the inner wrapper and you take one of the stiffeners, which is just notebook paper. And for the outer wrapper, I'm just using that 9-pound onion paper. You take your mandrel with the hollow end and put the hollow end even with the end of the stiffener. And then you just roll it up. And once this is rolled up, you just give it a twist and press it against the bottom of the mandrel. And then you take your former and you push those in really well to have a place for the bullet nose to go. So that's your powder stiffener. And that's what's going to contain the powder. The service charge for these for a musket was 2.5 grams or about 68 grains of fine musket powder. Well, if you fill this guy up with 2F powder, it will exactly fill that, and weigh it, it comes out to 68 grains of powder. So exactly what it's supposed to contain. For carbines, they used a little less powder, but the cartridge was the same. So that's your powder stiffener, or the powder chamber rather. And then to complete the wrapping of the cartridge, you take your outer wrapper and your bullet and the powder chamber, and you unite the bullet to the powder chamber. And you want to leave, about 3/4 of an inch on this end, on the bullet end of the cartridge. And then you want to carefully wrap them up. And you want to make sure that you wrap this nice and tight against the bullet, because that is, a paper patched bullet that you're making. So you want it nice and tight around that bullet. All right, and so then at this point, you take the tail end of the cartridge and you twist and push down into that bullet cavity, and you can use your former again to push it nice and tight down in there. And then you extract, and mine tends to want to stick on this cardboard, on this masking tape rather. You would extract the mandrel. And of course, I'm pulling out the powder stiffener with it. And so it can be useful, if that happens to you, to use a pen or something and push that back down in place. All right, so this is the finished wrapping of the cartridge. And you'll see that this ends up being, about 576 or so, 573, 576, so it ends up 575. That's just about the size that you want it to be. And the next step, according to the ordnance manual, or according to these musket manuals, the next step would be to charge these with the powder, and then you will take the tail and you kind of twist and push so that it goes down into the end of that powder stiffener, and that's your finished cartridge that you will then dip lubricate. So I use a tin of, this is SPG lube. In 1855, they were using a lube that was 6 parts beeswax to 1 part tallow. Later on, they went to all beeswax, or beeswax with just a little bit of mineral spirits in it. But anyway, they would take their charged, wrapped cartridge, and you would preheat them by letting them sit on a table that was heated by steam, and that would get them nice and warm. And then your wax is heated to about 230 degrees Fahrenheit, and you dip you dip these into the lube, and when they come out, it looks about like this. And basically what you're doing is you're lubricating the bullet end of the cartridge to finish that paper patched bullet. So that's the way by the ordnance manual. But when I'm making these, I don't want to have heat. I mean, I'm using an electric hot plate to heat my lube and melt my lube. But even so, I'd just as soon not have any heat around the powder at all. So I don't want to be lubricating charged cartridges if I can help it. And it turns out you don't have to. You can take the cartridge before you've charged it, and you can go ahead and dip lubricate them, and then they're ready for charging after the fact. So that's the order that I do it in. So that's basically it. That's the 1855 style Enfield cartridge. I'll show you one more little trick here. Because the onion paper is a little bit expensive, I think it's cost me like 20 bucks for a single 8.5 by 11 ream of the stuff. Rather than use it to make both the outer and inner wrapper, you can use computer paper, regular old typing paper, for the inner wrapper and the stiffener. But if you do that, it's going to result in a little bit thicker diameter powder chamber. So instead of taking a 1/2-inch dowel and wrapping it up with tape, you can just use a 1/2-inch dowel outright. And so I'll show that. So this is using typing paper for both, or printer paper rather, for both the wrapper and the stiffener. And another downside to using these, the printer paper for both of these is that for the inner wrapper is that it gets a little bit harder to compact this cavity at the end of the powder chamber because this is thicker paper than it's supposed to be. So it doesn't quite work as well as it ought to. But it'll save some money, and that's always a good thing. So then we can take the onion skin paper, which you still have to use with these large diameter early style bullets, and you join them together, and you can see the nose doesn't quite go in there as well as it did with the thinner cartridge paper. And again, we wrap them up. And you can see it's buckling a little bit because the nose isn't in there quite as good as it was. But that gives you a way to utilize the printer paper and save a little bit of money because you don't have to make the powder chamber using the expensive onion skin paper. But in period, that's what they use. They use two styles of paper, a thicker paper for the stiffener and a thinner paper for the bodies of the cartridge and the wrapper for the powder cylinder. So that's it. That's the 1855 Enfield style cartridge. Hope you like it. Subscribe if you do. Thanks.